My name is Penny Gherkin, and I've lived in Bolton for 42 years. I've probably been on more town committees than most human beings should have a right to be, but I've enjoyed it, and I am here today to ask some questions of our chairman of the select board and our town administrator. And let me introduce them. This is Brian Boyle, who is the chairman of the selectmen, and Marie Salvavaro, who is the town administrator.
Hey everybody, as Penny said, my name is Brian Boyle. I've lived in Bolton since 2016, and actually a couple weeks after I moved to town, I was able to get involved with the advisory committee, which is the finance committee. So I served on that committee until 2023, and then I was elected to the select board, and I've been serving there since then in the past year as chair.
I'm Marie Salvavaro. I'm the town administrator, and I've been in that role since July 1st of 2024. I bring 10 years of municipal government experience, and that was preceded by almost 10 years of serving on volunteer government committees.
So, we're going to ask questions about the upcoming budget for the town. We're really here to discuss the budget for upcoming fiscal year, fiscal 26. Which will be considered at the annual town meeting on May 5th of this year. Brian, can you give us a snapshot of what the budget's going to look like for FY26?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity to talk because I think it's really important for all the voters in Bolton really to understand the situation that we're in this year. So towns by law are required to have a balanced budget, which means our expenses have to match up with our revenues. But this year, for fiscal 26, we have a $1.975 million gap between our expenses and our revenue. And so we are going to be asking the town's voters to consider approving an override so that we can make up for that $1.975 million gap.
Okay, so Marie, Brian just mentioned an override. Can you explain what an override is?
An override is a ballot question which enables a permanent increase in the tax rate. Basically, it is the approval to balance your revenues by raising it from the taxpayer.
That's fairly straightforward. When was the last time we had an override, Brian?
Well, you probably know better than I do.
Well, I was around, but you have to know about these things.
So,
I can't give you all the answers.
I believe the last time the town approved an override was in 2004. And I think it's important for the taxpayers to understand, you've probably heard the phrase Proposition 2.5, but what that actually means and how it affects a town is that each year you have a certain amount of money that you can raise as part of your tax levy. And in Bolton, the vast majority of our sources of tax levy are from residential taxes. So you have that tax levy, and the law, Proposition 2.5, says you can only increase it each year by 2.5%. So there's an automatic cap by virtue of that law of 2.5% each year. So since 2004, we've actually managed to get by with that 2.5% increase. But as you can imagine, over the past 2+ decades, our population has increased, services have grown, education costs have grown, employee benefit costs have grown, and there comes a point for the vast majority of communities where Prop 2.5 creates a hard wall, and we've hit it this year, which is why we need to ask for an override.
So basically what our override is going to fill in is a normal budget. You have normal budget of A. You can add 2.5%, which gives you a normal budget of B, and you don't need an override. But when you have more than that amount, then we need the override.
Exactly.
Okay. What is the process for approving an override?
Actually, if I could just add a
Yeah.
little more to that, as Brian had mentioned, we are restricted by 2.5, but some of the things that folks have read about in the news, such as increasing health insurance costs or increasing property insurance costs or pension costs, are growing at about 8 to 12% per year, which is a hurdle that we're facing this year.
And school costs.
And school costs.
I mean, that's a significant increase. So what's the process of the override? How does it all work?
Okay, so great question, and really there's two basic steps for an override. The first is that on May 5th, which is our annual town meeting, we need a majority of voters to come out and approve the proposed FY26 budget. So that's step one on Monday, May 5th at annual town meeting. And then exactly 1 week later, on May 12th, there will be an election, our annual town election, and there will be a question on the ballot about approving the override. And we need a majority of Bolton voters to approve the override there. So there's the town meeting, there's the town election, and then that's how an override gets approved.
So, but we have to we have to pass both of them.
Yes.
If one doesn't pass, then we don't get the override, and then we have to somehow pick up the difference.
Correct.
And what are the options if the override doesn't pass, Marie?
Part of the constraint we're facing is we have approximately $1.2 million of costs that are, in effect, assessments. That's inclusive of education costs, pension costs, as well as health insurance costs for both our active employees as well as our retirees. I've been going through the budget with the fine-tooth comb, and I'm not seeing fat on the town side. So one of the options, though, would be a reduction in the services that Bolton residents are currently receiving.
And that could be any type of reduction in services, no matter what the department is, whether it's...
My interest is in protecting public safety and first responders. I can talk about the categories of services that would be affected. As I'd mentioned earlier, I view public safety and public works as baseline services. Unfortunately, what that means is that culture and recreation services that make Bolton Bolton would be on the first tier for reductions. This is inclusive of the library as well as the park and rec programs and these lifeguards at the town beach. Secondarily then, hoping this is not death by 1,000 cuts, I'd be looking at the human services. We have an assessment for Neshoba, Neshoba Associated Boards of Health, which we're obligated to pay, but the other components, inclusive of the Council on Aging, would also be under consideration for reduction.
Sorry, I'm wondering if we want to make it even more stark, because I'm just looking like we'd have to find 1.9 million from the town side only.
Correct.
So if you just add up culture and recreation and
That's not going to do it.
human services, that's still not even 1 million. So to get to almost 2 million, we'll have to look at cutting hours for town hall, probably skeleton staffing, even when it comes, like we want to try to hold public safety harmless, but if the money's not there, we'll have to take a hard look at everything.
It would be a hard look at everything. This does not encompass, by holding public safety and public works harmless, the administrative support as well as the administration of those functions, though, would be evaluated. With regards to town hall and municipal operations, we obviously need to have certain municipal functions, but our current opening hours would be reduced by at least 1 day.
Does that mean that everything will be slowed down?
Everything would be slowed down. Likewise, it would become more difficult for residents who do come in or want to ask a question to access the town hall, and individuals who are compensated hourly would be working fewer hours. There would be ongoing delays.
Now, someone might ask, we're talking about $1.9 million override. If it doesn't pass, God forbid, if it doesn't pass, could we go back and say, we need $1 million and we'll figure out how to get 900,000 out of what we have right now through cuts and reductions? Is that a likelihood, or is that nothing that has ever been done before?
It could occur. What that would mean, though, is that some of the reductions that we've been discussing, such as the culture and recreation, such as the reduction in town hall hours, would definitely be
Yeah.
occurring, because we do have these assessed costs that we can't negotiate down and that are unaffected by our current
Yeah,
employment
you
levels.
can't tell the insurance company not to charge you.
Right.
Yeah,
Or pension.
yeah. Now, anything else the town needs to know about an override?
Well, I think for those that are at home that may have some more questions or want more details, it might be helpful for us to just walk through a few slides that kind of paint a more detailed picture of what we're going through. So on this first slide, which is called last year's budget, you'll see what I talked about earlier, where towns have to have a balanced budget. Last year, our total expenditures were $31.6 million, and our total revenue was also $31.6 million. Just to give you a quick sense of how that $31.6 million is spent, you'll see here the various categories of town spending, and these are the categories that you see every year at annual town meeting. It includes everything that the town does, including public safety, public works, library, council on aging, and then it also includes our education assessments. On this next slide, you can actually see all of those different categories of spending broken up by what percentage they are. And you can see that, as usual, and no exception from other towns of our size, education is the lion's share of all of our spending. And then all of the town side makes up less than, well, just around 30%. This next slide gives an overview of our revenue. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of our revenue in the town of Bolton comes in the form of property taxes. So 88% of all of our revenue is from that taxation. And then there's a few other categories where we get some money, including local receipts. So those are things like licenses and fees and your motor vehicle excise. And then a very small amount of state revenue. Less than 1% of our revenue is from state sources. And then we sometimes have other available funds, again, in small amounts. And in the recent past, we have had to use what we call free cash to balance our budget. But as Marie could say, that's not really a best practice, because free cash is that money that you should be using for things like capital projects. And we really need to get out of the habit of using free cash, or else we'll end up in this situation again.
One of the reasons to not use the source of funding free cash that Brian had mentioned with regards to offsetting the operating budget is the town has many capital assets, its buildings, its equipment, its vehicles, and we have not been keeping up with maintaining those assets, which are collectively owned by all the residents. Just like in one's own house, if you defer putting on a roof until the roof has started leaking and has caused additional damage, you've gone too far. And in effect, we would like to start a trend of using our one-time funds for applying them to maintain those capital assets that Bolton has purchased.
Now, people keep talking about free cash, but there's nothing free about free cash.
There's nothing
Could we try
free.
to explain what free cash is?
Free cash is the monies that occur, that result from expenses coming in less than expected, which doesn't typically occur, as well as additional revenues from permits and fees. Over the past couple of years, folks may have heard mention of the ARPA money or the COVID monies. Some of those one-time funds had been applied. Other funds for permits and fees or interest income has left Bolton in a more stable position. Unfortunately, free cash for the past year is lower than it has been in maybe 8-10 years, which is another harbinger that we need to establish a stable financial funding source for our ongoing operations.
The next slide just gives you a snapshot of what those revenues look like in terms of pieces of the pie. And as I mentioned, nearly 90% of all of our revenue comes from residential taxes, which is why when we need an override, the burden of that override falls on individual households and taxpayers. Now, this next slide focuses on this year's budget, FY26. And as you can see here, right now, we are not in a balanced budget situation because we have a shortfall of $1,975,002. Notably, we're spending money on the same categories of services, but a couple areas where you can see substantial changes are in education, where the year-to-year increase is $2.7 million. Now, I want to pause here and just say that $2.7 million increase in the education category isn't just what it takes to operate the school from year to year. It also includes one of our first big debt service payments to the high school building project, which is why you see a big jump there. And then the other big jump is in the category of employee benefits. And as Marie mentioned earlier, we saw huge increases in health insurance, which virtually every other city and town is facing this year as well. This slide just shows you once again a snapshot of those expenditures. And then this slide called Expenditure Trends shows the past several years of fiscal year and what has been spent on the town side and what has been spent in terms of our education assessment. As I mentioned earlier, we will be asking voters to approve an override of $1.975 million. And the two key steps are going to occur on May 5th, which is our annual town meeting, and May 12th, which is our annual town election.
Why don't you go back and talk about how, because the biggest chunk of what we spend our taxes on is the schools, the arrangement with the schools and the 2/3,
Sure.
the different towns. When we regionalized K through 12, Bolton was originally K through 8. Then the 3 towns decided to go to regionalize through K through 12. I'll let you explain what those pieces are and how, if we don't pass one, we still are stuck with the cost.
Sure. So first thing I want to explain is that when you look at the education component of our budget, it includes Neshoba, which is obviously the biggest piece, but it also includes our Minuteman assessment because we have a number of students that go to Minuteman for their vocational education. But let's just focus on Neshoba for a moment because it is the largest portion of our education assessment. There are 3-member towns, Bolton, Lancaster, and Stowe. And under our regional agreement, the school district's budget needs to be approved by 2 out of the 3-member towns. So what that means is if Lancaster and Stowe approve the school district's budget this year,
Even if we turn it down.
even if Bolton turns it down, the school district's budget is approved, and it means that every member town, including us, has to pay the assessment in the school district's budget. And now just to boil it down even further, what that means is that if we don't pass the override, but the school district's budget does pass, then the entire $1.9 million shortfall has to be drawn exclusively from the town's services. Do you want to say anything else on that?
And the most notable thing for us this year is the school expense, or operating expense increase, which is over $900,000, which would be crippling for the town side to absorb.
Yeah, you wouldn't have the town that you have right now.
Right.
Okay. And I will finish with one thing about the increase in the school budget. Years ago, we had a similar, probably 25 years ago, 30 years ago, dates me a bit, that the budget had increased and someone said, well, I don't have kids in school anymore, so why should I pay? The reason that you should pay is that someone paid to have the school that your kids are going to now that you're happy with. So it's your obligation to do that, whether you have kids are in school now. I paid when my kids were in school, and now I'm paying for kids who come along behind. So it's more of a town responsibility and what we owe to the kids in this town. And that's, the bottom line, the biggest increase is in the educational piece of this whole thing. But that's why. So.
The other thing about the school is, although people have had their children go through the school, and they've likely had their lives improved by amazing teachers who've since retired, those teachers are still securing their retiree insurance through the school now, and it's sort of an ongoing, beyond just pay it forward, you're paying for the person who had made such a difference in your child's education.
Yep.
There were a couple other things that I thought taxpayers may be wondering about. Obviously, everybody's going to be wondering, what will this override actually look like in terms of its impact on the taxpayer? So on this first slide, you'll see it's called, "What is the override's impact on taxpayers?" There's actually a calculator that we can go on and plug in what the impact would be. So if you insert a $1.975 million override, the impact on the average single family tax bill is estimated to be $976
For the year.
for the year.
Okay, and that's divided up into 4 quarters for every time, because we have quarterly tax bills.
Yeah, but that's just the increase. There's also all the other stuff baked in, but that's an additional $976.
Could you also point out, though, is that everyone's tax bill, or is that for a certain valuation? Because as I understand it, there's a wide variety of residential assessed properties.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is for the average single family tax bill, and right now in Bolton, the average single family home is assessed at $820,000. So if your home is assessed at more than $820,000, that impact will be greater. And if your home is assessed at less than $820,000, it'll be a lesser impact.
And that sort of runs as a sort of average 4-bedroom house
Right.
kind of thing.
Yep. Now, the other thing, because we really want to present the full picture so that taxpayers aren't shocked, the other thing that you can expect to see in the next year is the impact from the high school building project. Now, on this next slide, what about the high school building project? We just have a reminder that the high school building project was approved at special town meeting in September 2023. It was approved by 78% of those who voted. And so what that did is it committed the towns of Bolton, Lancaster, and Stowe to paying for a new high school building project. And we took a vote to assume responsibility for the debt payments for that new high school. Now, we are going to have a large debt payment coming online this year of roughly $1.6 million. Now, the impact to the average family taxpayer of that debt payment is about $828. And you can see that on this next slide. What about the high school building project? So when you combine the impact of the override with the impact of the high school debt, the impact for the average single-family tax-paying home in Bolton is just north of $1,800.
That's an increase over their present taxes.
Yes, an increase of $1,800. And again, that's for the average single-family home of $820,000 value. And then just lastly, to give folks a sense of when they would expect to see these impacts, when the tax rate is officially set this coming December 2025, bills will be issued at the very end of December, and your first payment with these new impacts will be due February 1st, 2026. So that is when you would see a fairly substantial increase in your tax bills.
And how long will these continue for?
So for the high school building project,
For the high school building project, that would be a 30-year bond, and as the superintendent had stated at the special town meeting, they've secured a great interest rate at 4%. For the override, that would be a permanent increase.
it basically gets built into our new baseline from this point forward.
But it's 4%, that won't change.
For the interest, no, that is secured. So the second bonding tranche had closed just last week on February 20th.
So some people might wonder, okay, let's say this override passes, and we hope that it does. How does that set us up for future years? And our hope and expectation is that by passing this $1.975 million override, that the town would be in a position of not having to go back to the taxpayers for several years to request another override. We really do view this as like a turning point for the town to sort of right size our tax base by approving this override. Now, of course, it will also require strong partnership with Minuteman and Neshoba because they are almost 70% of our town's expenses. And so even if we are controlling things on the town side, the education budget also needs to be as tightly controlled as possible to make sure that we're not in a position of requesting an override in another few years. But we think that this one puts us in good shape.
So there's no getting around it. It's going to cost more money. But we're going to end up with a new high school, and hopefully the increase in the school budget will level off sooner or later because it can't keep going like this. All the towns can't afford that. But we'll just see what comes along.
And if I could just close with a couple words to Bolton's residents. First is that on this next slide, you'll see contact information for myself and for the town administrator. So you can see our email addresses there. Please reach out to us if you have questions. We'll also be making an effort to share this information with other folks between now and annual town meeting, because we really want to make sure people understand the situation and are educated about both the impacts of passing the override, but also the impacts of not passing the override. For any residents that would like to learn more about the budget process for the town or the school, I can tell you that shortly we're going to be putting materials up on the town's select board page, so you'll be able to look through those there. And then the school district, if you go to nrsd.net, on their homepage, if you just scroll down slightly, you'll see a tab for the FY26 budget development, and you just click there and it shows you all the information that they've been reviewing for the past several months, including all of the slides that show exactly how the school district's budget is going to be spent. And so that's a really good source of information for the Neshoba part of the equation. So thank you so much for tuning in and educating yourself about the situation. And we will look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on Monday, May 5th, 2025 for annual town meeting.